Good morning and welcome. As Sherry mentioned, if you are watching this in a group, you will definitely need to type your names into the chat box for her, but you will also need to submit can't think of the name of it. Sorry. There's an attachment that came out with the handout yesterday that has both the webinar evaluation form and a roster. If you are watching in a group and you're wanting credit, CE credit, you'll need to put your name on that roster as well and submit both the evaluation form and the roster to Darlene Davis. And you can see here that we need you to do that no later than November 8th. Because if she receives the form on November 9 or after, she will not be able to process. And that is for both APA and NASP credits. And we will be able to verify your attendance by the Ready Talk session electronic attendance records. Okay, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Grossman now. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Kimball and Sherry, and good morning and welcome to all to the third in our series on personality processes following our initial webinar series for the MCMI-IV. Here we're going to be getting into yet another level, taking a bit of a deeper dive into a couple of the personality patterns. And a number of these patterns that we've chosen for the reason that they tend to be hot topics right now, or they tend to be an area of greater clinical concern or possibly some levels of confusion. And to begin with, on this one, we have chosen a deeper dive into the narcissistic and antisocial spectra of Dr. Millon's theory. And we're taking our focus to some degree off of the MCMI-IV proper in itself, but throughout this entire presentation, what we'll be referring to is the information that you can get from the MCMI-IV and how that can be best applied to some of these challenges. To just start off the presentation for today, just want to mention rather briefly here that because we are working in a CE mode for this one, we have a couple of procedures, some of which Dr. Kimball already covered, that are necessary for in order to conform to the guidelines of CEs, for both APA as well as state associations. First and primary element that I want to cover is a very brief disclosure, and that is that I am a co-author of the MCMI-IV, and I do have a minor royalty holding for the instrument itself. So I want to be able to just put that out there in terms of financial disclosures that I do receive a financial benefit from this. I do try to be as objective and show the strengths and non-strengths as much as possible when we're talking about the instrument. There are no relevant non-financial relationships to disclose. And also, just on behalf of Pearson, the Pearson Clinical Assessment Division, the sponsor of this webinar, develops and distributes assessments and intervention tools for psychologists and speech-language pathologists. The webinar covers information that pertains to the effective and appropriate use of the MCMI-IV, for which Pearson is the distributor and publisher. Okay. Following the webinar, we've been given some further information. We've just began to show you a little bit about that. But in terms of exactly how to receive your CE credit, there's a process to go through, as Dr. Kimball referred to. And just to reiterate once again, you have approximately a week to complete those requirements and turn those in, and also to make sure that you are typing your name in as suggested before. So if you do want CE credit for this, make sure that you follow those directions. Now we want to move on to the more substantive part of our program for today, and this would be that deeper dive into the narcissistic and antisocial spectra, which are just two of the spectra of the 15 that are represented on the MCMI-IV. For this particular webinar, we are making the assumption that you have probably at this point either familiarized yourself with the theory to some degree on your own, or you've attended a prior webinar where we've gone further into more of the mechanics of the theory itself. I will be offering a brief overview and refresher on the theory, but by nature and because we are going into a much more specific content area, it really will be brief. Our main area of concern today, our main area where we will be focusing our information is in the number 2 range over here, and that is the focus on these two personality spectra and the distinctions between the two. With that in mind, we have 3 basic learning objectives that we'll be covering through the course of the webinar today. That is describing the motivating aims of the narcissistic and the antisocial personality patterns, the motivating aims being the polarity structure, as well as the domains to some degree of both of those patterns. We want to then compare, and we'll be spending some time looking at manipulation patterns that are evidenced by both of those patterns, how they are the same and how they're different, how it is that we're able to take a look at the more molecular views and some of the nuances of each of those patterns, and then be able to move on to number 3, which is explaining treatment directions, looking primarily at the individual's motivating aims as well as the domains of theory, to be able to get as clear a view as possible as to what we're looking at. A little bit of commentary on this just before we go. I want to emphasize from the very beginning that my approach to this, and it has always been my approach, is not to focus so much on what it is that we come up with in terms of a diagnosis and trying to add in as much incremental validity as possible by use of the MCMI-IV towards that diagnosis. That is important. That is a big part of why it is that we use the instrument. But what I'd like to try to emphasize as much as possible are the distinctions that lie underneath. Very rarely are we going to find a pure prototypal textbook variant of one particular diagnostic label. So that becomes something that we use as a broad distinction, but not something that's a very useful clinical distinction as we move along. So I'll be going from that more concrete of the diagnostic labels and then down more into the specifics of that, which are more having to do with domains and such. So approximate time frame for our agenda, and as usual, we are already a bit behind, but we will try to do as best as we can to follow this to some degree, leaving enough time for us to have some questions and answers and some final words on how exactly to complete your CEs. So with that in mind, we want to move on, and just as an introductory area, a very brief recap of Millon's evolutionary theory and where these patterns come from. Dr. Millon initially put together his speculations about personality patterns in a biosocial learning theory. That was his predominant model up until the late 1980s, early 1990s, where he then started to attach these thoughts more to the same ubiquitous laws that exist in our universe for not just humans, but all organisms, all living matter, all of which shared certain motivating aims, that is, I would say, core motivations for how it is that a person, using personality, not necessarily as one where you think of it being a more operational thing, but using their personality in a way to be able to meet certain necessities of their world. And Dr. Millon, borrowing from other psychology leaders as well as borrowing from evolutionary biology, put together a schema which allows for the generation of all the different personality patterns, having to do with 3 primary personality motivation and motivating polarities. The first of them being existence. But humans and organisms and all kinds of living life follow this basic idea that first an organism has to exist, a very basic idea. Tending to exist leads one to move towards either avoiding those things that might bring about non-existence, that is the pain continuum or life-sustaining strategy, or trying to get as much out of life, pleasure-enhancing sort of a strategy. In personalities, I like to think of this as how a person is energized, and that is, what is it that really invokes their will to live, and what is it that really drives them to be able to interact with and really integrate with their world. Is it more towards remaining safe or trying to get as much out of life as possible? You'll see in one of the examples today that this does have a lot to do with just how engaged a person might be. Next, once an organism exists, that organism must also adapt, interact with its environment, which most will do in one or the other way, either passively accommodating into the environment, that is finding an environment that's suitable enough, and changing the self in order to be able to survive. The other end of the continuum is an active continuum where the individual creates the environment and changes the environment, modifying the environment to suit the individual's needs. All of this works for the individual, but the next question comes in as far as how we keep those organisms like us continuing on after us, because we have a finite life. Therefore, there has to be a replication strategy, and this is included in all as well. Borrowing from evolutionary biology's R versus K strategy of many progeny versus very few, and how it is that we interact with those progeny, we make a jump over to personality where a personality may be self-oriented, more independent, more so concerned with nurturance of the self, or much more other-oriented, the opposite of that. And a major point of all of this is that personalities, if they were just static and relying on one versus the other strategy on any of the three polarities, would be very personality disordered. This requires adaptivity, flexibility, the ability to be able to respond to the environmental cues and respond in a way that makes sense for what's there. Maybe having your favorite strategies, which is what all personality tendencies tend to be, but then again, also having to be able to move as necessary whenever it's called for. That is what the lower section of this slide is all about. And that is how one is oriented, very strongly towards one side or the other, not as much towards one side or the other, or showing one of the other dynamics, such as being conflicted, where it might be that one doesn't have a clear motivation on any one given of these polarities. That's the only one that we'll be going into today with the combinations that we have, is the idea of conflict. What if somebody is both self and other-oriented? What if somebody has a lot of trepidation about being active and has some hesitation about that? We'll be getting into some of those dynamics as we go through our number of examples that we have for today. We have from that, going from the motivating aims over to what we're familiar with on the MCMI as the different personality patterns, each one of these being represented by one of the personality scales, the primary scales. We have this grouping of 15 personality spectra. Along the right-hand column, for the most part, we see the clinical disorders that we're familiar with. The exceptions, again, being the last three, which are the more structurally compromised, schizotypal, borderline, and paranoid, where there's a shift towards what we would call the middle. There's not really a comparison to a more adaptive variant of this, that even where what we would call the normal styles over on the first of these is not so much described as normality. Therefore, there's also a further category for the clinical disorders, and those three is schizophrenic, cyclophrenic, paraphrenic. These are not the patterns that we're going to be looking at today, so I'm not going to be spending a lot of time on that. But the overall picture, what I want to describe for you here, is that each of these spectra relate to different base rates on the MCMI-IV, and they are a range of adaptivity to maladaptivity, going from normal style through an abnormal type and on to clinical disorder, and described, depending on your preference, either by the labels that are on the MCMI, as schizoid, avoidant, and so on, or if you choose to use the short acronyms for the spectra, AA schizoid representing apathetic, asocial schizoid, SR avoidant being shy, reticent, avoidant, and so on. You can print it out with those instead, with those short names. For our purposes today, we're going to be focusing primarily on these two. We will be looking at what happens when these are admixed with others in the spectrum, but for the most part, our primary concern today is going to be the narcissistic and the antisocial spectra, with some focus on manipulative patterns and, to some degree, how it is that the different others in the spectrum affect it. The next level down, I've been referring to something called domains throughout this, and again, hopefully you have some familiarity with this, and I'll only go through this very briefly, is that we have this expression up here at the top of the evolutionary polarities: pleasure, pain, active, passive, and self-other, and how it is that they express themselves on a more molecular level, which is down at the bottom here, and that is through a series of functional and structural domains. All of these being expressions that are included with all of the personality patterns. So there are a number of different levels. There's 4, being behavioral, phenomenologic, intrapsychic, and biophysical, and then a series of both functional as well as structural domains, of which there are 8, covering a number of different facets of personality that are consistent across all of the personality patterns. So instead of just having criteria that are primarily cognitively based or primarily affectively based, we have those in this system, within this theory, that describe all of the different spectra, as well as all of the different domains. We have a comparability if we look across, from expressive emotion to interpersonal conduct, cognitive style, and so on, all the way across those 8 domains. You'll also see some of these that are highlighted, and those that are highlighted are identified as Grossman facet scales on the MCMI-IV. There are 3 facet scales for each one of the spectra. Again, primarily today we'll be looking at the 2 primary examples that we're going to be using: narcissistic and the antisocial spectra, and parts of their domains and such that are relevant for this exploration. So let's take a look and begin our deeper dive now into the narcissistic and antisocial personality patterns. The first of these patterns is the narcissistic spectrum, and you'll see the chart similar to what you've seen just before, but with those emphases built in and showing on these. For what we would call a textbook narcissist, that is not one that you would typically see in practice as a pure prototypal narcissist. It's relatively uncommon to see someone who fits that directly, and part of what we're going to look at today are those variations. But to utilize the textbook example to which we can take that and compare real-life examples to, what we would see is a primary motivating pattern that is defined by its passivity and its self-orientation. And how that primarily works is the idea that this person essentially believes that they don't need to engage on a very strong level in order to have the good things that are coming to them. There is that sense of entitlement, and it's a rather passive sense of entitlement, which is very different from the other pattern that we'll look at. I mentioned before that I like to look at the existence polarity as one in which how a person might be described in terms of their engagement with the world. And here we have an average sort of engagement on both pleasure and pain. There is some concern for this person in terms of how it is that they want to manage their life in terms of remaining safe as well as going after those things that they want in life. But again, it's kind of a wash. And in a way, you start to see that in some of the more affective expression. They do have a very vibrant emotional life underneath, but it's rarely shown to the outside world. And you tend to see this sort of devil-may-care and insouciant sort of a mode that seems to pervade. It doesn't seem like things really bother them unless you get to that one or the other thing that really happens to hit a target for them. Also in this pattern, you tend to have this tendency of not being active whatsoever, really, the sense that others will do for me. That does not mean that they are not manipulative, but it's in a much more passive and a much more set the wheels in motion and allow things to happen sort of a way. Also, very little concern for others. It's not so much that they consider others to be unimportant, but it's really only in terms of them being important for their needs, whatever those might be. Looking at this more on a molecular level, this is what the theory tends to predict in terms of how a prototypal narcissist might display or might evoke many of these different patterns within their personality. Those shaded in the darker color are those that are represented by the facet scales on the MCMI. That's not always what's prominent, however. But what we see here are that what tends to be prominent both in the instrument as well as in the theory for this one is an exploitiveness in terms of interpersonal conduct, an admirable self-image, and an expansive cognitive style. We will see many of the other patterns, however. I mentioned the insouciant mood. It's a less important mode in terms of at least the textbook narcissist, although you will see that as a characteristic. In some expressions, that may become more important, but if you were working with the prototypal textbook narcissist, you wouldn't necessarily be paying a lot of attention to that, though you might notice it. What you might see a little bit more of is the rationalization dynamics. That is, what is their defense mechanism? Goes directly to being able to justify whatever it is that they are looking to justify. And you may also have some attention paid to that sort of haughty behavior, that above it all sort of way of simply behaving, of reacting to things, of the general sorts of behavioristic kinds of measures that you might see. We'll focus on one or the other of these details as we go along, but I want to move along now to the antisocial spectrum. Very similar to the narcissist in a lot of ways, and in fact, I'll be showing you some slides that deal with the very real combination that happens more frequently than not, actually, where you have some narcissistic and some antisocial characteristics. And you will see two elevations come up on the MCMI-IV with some regularity with that, because there are a lot of areas that cross over. But the primary distinction between the narcissist and the antisocial, as far as the theory is concerned, is in the adaptation mode. Still very self-oriented, but active rather than passive, coming from the notion that a prototypal antisocial is going to come from a perspective of feeling as though they're not going to get anything unless they go after it. A much more active sort of stance, much more geared towards making sure that they get what they want because it's not going to be given to them. Some of the other distinctions as well is that within the existence mode, you tend to see somewhat of an orientation towards pleasure, although it's not a primary motivation, but notably a disregard for life-sustaining or pain orientations. Again, this is in the prototypal. When you start to have admixtures, that may change, But what really defines the prototypal antisocial in that regard has to do with a disregard for what happens to other people. Again, that's a diminishment of concern for others, but also what happens to the self. One of the more shocking moments in my early career was working with somebody who clearly met this pattern. Not entirely prototypal, but definitely showed that lack of concern for pain or life-sustaining, where this person was part of within the legal system and was describing all the things that could happen if he were to get into different kinds of conflicts and confrontations and how deadly they can be. And I foolishly asked the question at the time, well, what if you get harmed? What if something happens to you? What if you get killed? His response was, so? It gives you sort of an idea as to how it is that they view relationships. And that's going to become very important as we move on, as we look at some of the other combinations and some of the key differences between narcissistic tendencies, which really are, although they don't have a clear concern for others, they do have a concern for maintaining their relationships, versus antisocial, where it's only so much as what is a person worth in terms of an asset. On the more molecular level, we tend to have characteristics such as acting out dynamics. The immediate response to what might happen in their world is that acting out. That's a defense mechanism. Tend to be very irresponsible in terms of their interpersonal conduct. This is one where there's not a facet scale so much as there is a secondary item that actually shows up as something more consistent on the MCMI, but the expressive emotion, that is the behavioral aspect of impulsivity, was not something that was as clearly represented on the MCMI-IV in this variant as much as was the autonomous self-image, which is another very important part of this overall personality pattern. Also important here, tend to be nonconformist in terms of how they think about things. Tend to be rather unemotional, callous, which is part of the wiring, is what is believed to be the case. That callousness is a lack of real affective responsiveness underneath, and that's a key difference that we'll be showing in just a little while. And a tendency to think of introspective content, that is our object representations, as debased, as somehow flawed and terribly flawed, and never being able to be resurrected or never being able to be righted in any true way. The world around them is a place that's not going to give them anything. It's never given them what they needed, and therefore they have to get whatever they need in their own way. So to kind of summarize a little bit of what we've looked at so far, here's some of the key differences in terms of just the motivating aims. For the pleasure and pain orientation, the first line. For the narcissistic prototype, and again, I want to remind you that we're talking prototypes at this point, and we'll be getting into the admixture shortly. Both of those being essentially average, whereas we have a deficiency in the pain orientation for the antisocial. So a difference between really not showing much of the emotions that really are truly there, unless it's for more of an operational means on the narcissist side, to essentially deficient sort of a pain orientation and only average in terms of pleasure. That affective world really is somewhat lacking and really only is used on a more conscious level. We have opposites here in terms of the next line, that is passive versus active orientation. We have basically opposite statements for these two, whereas the narcissist is much more passive, the antisocial is much more active in terms of how it is that they move and manipulate and create the environment that they have around them. Clear similarity in terms of replication, in terms of their interpersonal modality, strong self-orientation, and a deficiency for others. But how they use the relationships as they're represented by others does tend to be a key difference as well. Looking at the domains, the 8 different domains as far as expression, as far as interpersonal world, as far as how it is they think about things and how they reflect on themselves, and what their affective makeup is all about. We see a couple of key differences, just to highlight a few. Where it's a sort of a hands-off, haughty expression, I'm above it all in the way of the superiority over on the narcissistic side, we have a much more engaged behavior, impulsive, not really taking the time to think about things, but simply acting on whatever is necessary right there. Some differences between how it is that they look at other people. There's an exploitive sort of a nature, which of course is also present for the antisocial when we're looking at the narcissistic side. But it tends to be that there's much less caring, and that tends to characterize the antisocial a little bit more. To some degree, the narcissist will show that kind of caring, oftentimes just to meet their own needs, but investing enough in relationships so that a continued narcissistic supply, and that's a word I'll use quite a bit as we go along, but that is assured as we go along. I'll only do one more in the interest of time, and we'll be looking at these differences as we go along, but just to show you again a little bit of the characteristics here. Those coming up higher on the narcissistic scale will tend to show a level of expansiveness in terms of how they think about things. The idea that their ideas, their view of the world is ahead of and better than most of the others in the world. Whereas the mental set on the antisocial side is not one that assumes that theirs is any better than anybody else's, but theirs is one that is much more engaged, and that is engaged towards fulfilling the needs of the self. You begin to get the idea, and if you look down the list, you can see that there are different descriptors here. And again, these may add mix. You may have a person who has both of these going on, where they might have some conflict between the different kinds of expressions. However, you'll see how they begin to add mix in much the same way as we look at a color wheel. Now, we have our primary colors of 3 different colors, and using the classic example of red, yellow, and blue, if we make combinations of those, if we put yellow and blue together, we're going to get green. Same thing for both the polarities as well as the domains. When you start to combine them, you start to see different characteristics. And we'll begin to build on that as we move along in this set. So what does happen now? This is what happens in most of our presentations. Again, very rarely are we going to see a pure prototypal anything, which is part of the reason why I like to get away from the labels. But you occasionally may see a single elevation, but even then you're going to see variations. What happens when you start to put these things together? Where do we have common ground to begin with for the narcissistic and antisocial manipulative patterns? For both, we tend to see people who will brandish anger. Might not feel like it's a very legitimate anger. It might be overblown sometimes. It might be underexpressed, but coming out at it in a more passive-aggressive sort of a form. But both may brandish anger. There's some difference in awareness, partially having to do with how much their brain is actually wired to experience a more genuine emotion. Both will tend to lie by omission, as well as commission to some degree, but I think more of a tendency to lie by omission. And frequent use of denial as far as what's going on in their world, what they see, how they tend to direct or misdirect in certain ways. In terms of characteristics that you'll see with both that lead to these manipulations, a common motivator for both of them is power. Now, how that power gets expressed, how that power gets used by them, why they seek that power differs considerably between the two. Both are looking for personal gain. Both are fueled by deficits. Again, there's a difference in awareness of what those deficits are. It may tend to be that someone in more of the narcissistic range is going to say they have no deficits. Are you kidding me? Everything's absolutely fine with me. The problem is with you. A person more on the antisocial end will probably express something more along the lines of, yes, I didn't get what I want. Yes, I have this problem. Yes, I have that. Therefore, I may have this chip on my shoulder, or I may have this need that I can justify that allows me to do what I'm going to do in a more overt sort of a way. And major part of the manipulation for both, and that is that there's a requirement, and that's built into the basic motivations that I showed you. Only by devaluing others can their manipulations work. Only, and that may be an active or a passive kind of a devaluation, but it really is the idea that people are either extensions of themselves or people are there as assets on which to be able to build whatever it is that I need to build. Commonly for the more narcissistic, you'll see a lot of projection, a lot of whatever the undesired feelings are on the inside, those are projected out. Frequent feigning of innocence and denial of responsibility, and sometimes in rather strange ways in which it's very well apparent as to what's going on, but yet you're having somebody, and this leads to the next point, gaslighting you. Somebody saying what you're seeing and what you're experiencing and what you know and what you are sensing with your own five senses is not really so. The tendency here is to try to undermine the other person so that they don't really know what it is that they are responding to, what it is that they feel. They start to doubt themselves so that they become more under the control of the person doing these manipulations. Common characteristics here, different from the antisocial. What we're looking at here as far as the unique primary motivator is something called narcissistic supply. That is that assurance, sometimes a reassurance, oftentimes just a reminder for them, and it's a demand that they continue to have the attention paid, the admiration paid, and so on. And that is a constant need for them. So therefore, they try to keep up their status. They try to cover their deficits and not show what it is that may be hurting them in any sort of a way. And there's a certain kind of protection, all of which may be in service to retaining relationships. Even after a relationship has been soured, there's a need to continue that relationship, even if it becomes perhaps even somewhat emotionally abusive. They want to hang on to those relationships because they are a source of narcissistic supply. Whether or not the person is more in their agreement or less in their agreement. Sometimes even better if they're somebody who's an adversary. That becomes somebody who can be attacked. On the other side of this, the antisocial manipulation, you're going to see a bit more seduction, and that way sort of a charm, a feigning of emotions, where they know that they essentially don't have clear, genuine emotions. They become very good at emulating them and attaching for that reason, but not a permanent attachment, as we'll see. You'll tend to see more direct line, a bit more diversion or evasion, and somewhat more transparent in terms of what the intent is if they are in fact caught, and also a tendency to be a bit more overtly aggressive in a lot of these areas. The difference here in terms of common characteristic for a unique primary motivator, here it's material gain. It's not so much what a person thinks of me, although there is such a thing as a reputation defending antisocial, where you have a lot of those narcissistic characteristics, and then you start to see a tendency to want to keep that status. But most of the time, status is de-emphasized. It's not really the most important part of this motivation. Typically speaking, as I spoke about before, usually they're more overt in terms of acknowledging their deficits. They say they have been in places where they have not gotten what they wanted, therefore this is what they're getting. And here's one of the key differences in terms of the value placed on the relationship and what to do with that. Again, relationships are devalued, but in a different way. Whereas for the narcissistic side, we tend to see that they hold on to relationships in order to continue to foster their supply. Here, with antisocials, there's a discarded relationship once the functional gain is taken care of. There may or may not be a critical incident after that. The relationship may not have soured necessarily, but it's no longer seen as useful for whatever reason that might be, and therefore there's that change. So our major distinctions then, on the more narcissistic end, relationally driven for admiration, the capacity for emotion, but not necessarily an engagement of emotion. One way to think about that is that there's really quite a bit of emotion that may be stirring underneath, and you'll see that occasionally in bursts of anger or bursts of other emotions, or when they feel that their needs are not being met to express that. And most of the time that's being more suppressed, more reactive to situations. And a tendency for revenge. This becomes really important when a relationship is soured. They'll hang on to that relationship, like I said, but they will hang on in order to continue to feed that narcissistic supply, oftentimes the way of doing that by seeking out revenge. For the antisocial, it's mainly about functional gain. It's self-interest driven, but it's not necessarily for a narcissistic supply. There's a true deficiency in experiencing real emotion. So a contrast here would be that whereas they don't really feel the emotion underneath, sometimes in order to get what they want interpersonally, they have to fake it. They have to make more of the emotion than what they truly, genuinely feel. There's a tendency to be more proactive in the way that they interact. And unless there's a functional gain to be had from the act of revenge, generally speaking, the relationship is discarded. So we don't see that tendency to seek out revenge, to continue the relationship in some somewhat meaningful way in that sort of a regard. So what then happens when we have a combination? This is a fairly common pattern. We see oftentimes in our presentations both narcissistic and antisocial characteristics. So what would that look like? Just looking very briefly at the similarities and differences, and there are different combinations, and I'll show you two different possibilities, and there are probably many others when we look at the domains. But the primary difference comes along that interaction mode, that adaptation to our world. One being passive, one being active. Tendency to disregard pain on one side, tendency to kind of give that all a wash on the other. So there are some core conflicts when it comes to this. In this sense, this person may have a difficulty, and it may be an inroad in terms of treatment, as we'll see later on, that we may look at whether or not the person feels as though they have to engage or they don't have to engage, and what does that mean in terms of reaffirming their sense of self. Now, here are two possibilities for what that might look like. Here's combination number one. This is taking those circles that I've used in the prototypes before and doing some combination. So you're going to see in red those that are related to the antisocial, in blue those that are related to the narcissistic, and the one that shows up here in purple is a combination of those two. You'll see that the ones that are highlighted, that have the shading, those are represented by Grossman facet scales, and the relative size of the circle has to do with the relative prominence of them. So what do we see here? We see, let's just take a look at the ones which are larger. This particular combination, this person tends to have a fairly high probability of showing rather haughty emotions, as described before. That's not a facet scale, but you might pick that up from a clinical interview. You also look at the MCMI and you see that as far as most of the facet scales, they're relatively in the moderate range. But here's one that really shows up, and it shows up in two places: the irresponsible and exploitive interpersonal conduct. Irresponsible being more along the lines of the antisocial, exploitive being more along the lines of the narcissistic. When you put them together, they mean something different, don't they? That tends to be that this person may truly give a sense of not caring about what it is that happens to another person. They really are feeling, and this is someone who I think may express more of the narcissistic side. They truly don't care about what it is that another person might experience from their interactions from them. They tend to act out a bit more. They tend to feel as though they are much more entitled in certain ways. And this is different from another combination. If we had a slightly different elevation, but still an elevation of 6A5, maybe in this one we have someone who shows much more impulsivity, tends to be much more expansive, tends to be much more along the lines of feeling that they are their own person and they don't have to worry about what other people think or feel about them. Many different combinations exist here. I am noticing in the interest of time that we have a bit to go, and we are coming towards the end of our assigned time for that. So I am going to go rather quickly through the rest of the examples. We're going to begin to look at two different examples that I like to use that illustrate how it is that one or the other of these patterns may combine with some of the other patterns in the overall Millon personality spectra, and we have different elevations there. What if we had, for example, a combination of narcissistic and melancholic sorts of characteristics? And just introduce these very briefly, and I'm going to go a little bit more into the dynamics of them in later slides. And I'll point out some of these differences as we go. So this would probably be the configuration that you may see for a 5-2B, that is a narcissistic and a melancholic sort of a presentation. And I'd probably characterize that, much as Dr. Millon has in the past, as sort of a voguish pattern. That is, that this person really feels as though they know how terrible things really are. Nobody else sees that as well as they do. And it really takes someone special to understand that we are all in this terrible situation, myself included. But that very strong passivity that comes up in both of the patterns tends to be one where, oh, there's nothing you can do about it. The other example that we'll be using is a combination of antisocial and avoidant, two of the personality patterns that you might not feel go together very easily, but yet there is a combination that really makes sense. Both very active, self-protective, one being more self-oriented, one being more pain-oriented, one being one that's very skittish about the threats that are out there in the world, but still wanting to get whatever their needs are met. So you see that combination of approach avoidance, and you also see the aggressiveness in those encounters that a person may have. Putting those together, you probably see a couple of the facet scales show up that are combined, both aversive and irresponsible. What does that mean then? If you have that combined interpersonal conduct, that fretfulness, but also the sense of not particularly caring about what happens to the other. So you have tendencies then for a person to go into these relationships for very brief amounts of times, get what they want, and leave whatever damage is there. The person probably also feels as though they don't have any real sense of belongingness, but it doesn't really matter in certain ways. Is that a defense? So these are some of the possible ways of looking at these. Again, rather briefly, I'm going to look at some of the treatment directions using these two examples and using a format that if you've gone through some of the webinars that I've presented in the past will seem somewhat familiar to you. It's essentially a 3-stage format where we begin on the first stage by looking at the motivating aims as well as the domains and looking at them in isolation. What you want to do here is develop a facility to describe rather than label. You only use the diagnostic categories secondarily and as they may be necessary if there is a diagnosis. But primarily you're looking at not the verbiage of, this tells you that you are antisocial, but rather a kind of a way of saying these are some of the characteristics, these are some of the things that people, and I use a more collaborative approach, people who have taken this test tend to show these kinds of characteristics. How does this relate to the experience that you have? So if we were looking first at the narcissistic prototype, we might be saying, okay, isolate that, don't look at anything else for right now, and if this said everything about you, and you would describe a way of saying that this feels like people that elevate the scale show that the world kind of is there for you. They feel as though things will happen, that they really have things under control, and that there isn't that much need to really become engaged. That people will be there for you, and people are there, and here's where it becomes something where you start to invoke some of the manipulation that might be there. People are there to suit your needs and see what comes from that, and begin to develop a therapeutic dialogue based on that. For the melancholic side of that, you may start to point out, but then again, sometimes things really trouble you. And it seems like that appears from your response to the MCMI that may be a major concern for you, that things are really pretty bad, and see what comes from that. For the other combination, the antisocial and avoidant, might be doing something similar there as well. In this one, I might be saying that this kind of represents someone who wants what they want and will go after whatever it is that they want without much concern for what damage that might do. And on the avoidance side of it, there is some concern for how it is that might affect you, and how it is that the view of other people might affect you, and how it is that you may feel like you want to avoid trouble as much as possible, but yet still get your needs met. After that, we would have the second component of that, which is beginning to combine those two. Where is it that the evolutionary polarities align? Where do they complement each other? Where might they conflict? So we might look here to say that there's a very strong passivity for this combination of narcissistic and melancholic. It really does start to create an air of nothing can be done about whatever the situations are. And yet, the personality pattern in and of itself seems to be one that really creates that as its own defense and its own manipulation in certain ways, in a way to be able to get your needs met by recognizing, yes, things are really like that. You may notice that some of the facet scales overlap. It just so happens for these two examples, both this and the antisocial example, there are two that overlap and two that are independent. And you may start to see overlapping components there as well, and you might be able to describe that. For the antisocial and avoidant, here we see a combination where the active part of the environmental cues is really activated throughout. No matter what, there's no room to be able to just rest and relax on your laurels. You really do have to keep on your toes for absolutely everything, both to get your needs met as well as to avoid those things that might become problematic for you, and how it is that those might overlap in this grouping. Finally, we start to look at the different combinations that lead to domain-specific kinds of interventions. When we look at the facets, we may be able to start to suggest treatment recommendations. That may be from the assessor to the person who might be doing therapy, but it also might be an inroad to say there are possibilities for you. If you look at the 5-2B combination, one of the things that is really clear about that is that woefulness. Well, it seems like you lead off with that quite a bit. It seems like this is a predominant sort of a difficulty for you. And also, it seems like you already do have the answers, but sometimes the answers don't seem to work for you. So what if we use that combination of pharmacologic and cognitive sorts of orientations as a first inroad? There's other things to explore, and then we might be able, in an integrative sort of a sense, to say, you might want to look at things that are more interpersonal. We may want to look at things that are more on a psychodynamic level, but this is how we begin to suggest that. And as a last note, we'll probably be doing something relatively similar for that combination of 6A and 2A. At this point, we have a couple minutes left, and I want to open the floor for a couple questions if we do have time for that. So I will turn the program over to Dr. Kimball. I will field what we can. If we're not able to get to your questions specifically, please put them in the chat box, and we will do our best to answer those as we go along. So, Dr. Kimball, to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grossman. We do have a couple of questions. I'm going to answer one broadly. If somebody's asking about how they can view prior trainings that you've done on the MCMI-IV, I'm just about, actually somebody else just sent out the website where you can find those trainings. If you'll scroll down that page to the training tab, you'll find pre-recorded webinars that Dr. Grossman has previously presented. So the question that I'll hand you, though, is someone is mentioning that this combination of antisocial and narcissistic personality reminds me of psychopathy, Hare's formulation. Have you done any study to examine the correlation between the PCLR and this personality presentation?
I would refer you to a book that was done by Dr. Millon along with Dr. Eric Simonson, and I think it was Dr. Roger Davis that was on that as well, from the late 1990s, and it was called Psychopathy. And I'm not sure if this specific question is answered within there, but I think it would be a good resource to look at those issues, where there's some combination. It's an edited book, and there are a number of chapters in there, and being the age that the book is at this point, I don't recall specifically what the chapters are. But if something would have been done along those lines, I would imagine that it would be within that book. And these patterns are patterns that were on the MCMI-III and date back some time, so they would still be relevant.
Okay, thank you. I don't have another question waiting, but I want to reiterate the requirements for obtaining CEs or CPDs for either NASP or APA. So we will need you, remember, to submit the webinar session evaluation form, and if you attended in a group, the group attendance roster. Both of those were attached in the reminder webinar with the handout, so if you'll print those out, fill them out, and send them back to Darlene Davis at the address you see here. This slide is also included in that handout, so if you don't get her email address written down quickly, it's in the handout. But be sure that you do that by November 8th, because if they're submitted on November 9, she will not be able to. She won't be able to receive them or to process them. And as you can all see, our chairperson has just sent out the link to the book that Dr. Grossman just mentioned, Psychopathy, Antisocial, Criminal, Violent Behavior.
Oh, terrific. I haven't seen a link for some time. That's good.
Yeah. Well, we don't have any awaiting questions. Again, Dr. Grossman, thank you so much for your time, and thank you all attendees for your time. It is the top of the hour, so we will close the webinar.